1. Yoselyn Ortega. Yoselyn Ortega was 50 years old when she committed an unthinkable crime in New York City in 2012. She had been the trusted family nanny for 2 years, caring for 6-year-old Lucia, whom everyone called Lulu, and her 2-year-old brother, Leo. Ortega had emigrated from Santiago de los Caballeros in the Dominican Republic and became a naturalized American citizen about 10 years before the tragedy. She lived in Manhattan with her teenage son, Jesus, along with family members sharing the same apartment. Known as a steady and dutiful caregiver, Ortega was regarded warmly by the Krim family, so much so that Marina and Kevin Krim had helped with travel costs for her visits home and included her in family gatherings. But behind this outward calm, there were undercurrents that would erupt into horror. In the months leading up to the crime, Ortega's mental health appeared to deteriorate. Her family testified that she experienced depressive episodes as early as adolescence, with the death of her sister triggering lifelong struggles. In her middle years, she spoke of hearing voices, auditory hallucinations, that sometimes commanded her to certain behaviors. She described seeing black shadows following her and spoke about a mysterious black man who wanted to separate people. Her emotional state seemed to unravel further after her son Jesus moved to New York. Family members recounted that she grew overwhelmed, prone to crying, and at times unable to leave the house. On a late afternoon in October of 2012, Marina Krim returned to the family's Upper West Side apartment with her 3-year-old daughter, Nessie, from a swim lesson. She had gone early concerned because Ortega had missed Lulu's ballet class. Inside the apartment's bathroom, she discovered Lulu and Leo motionless in the bathtub. Ortega was nearby, gravely wounded by self-inflicted cuts to her neck and throat. The children had been slain with kitchen knives in what law enforcement would later describe as an act of unspeakable betrayal. The investigation unfolded with shocking speed. Ortega was arrested and underwent psychiatric evaluations. 2 New York State psychiatrists deemed her mentally competent to stand trial. In 2018, a jury found her guilty of first-degree murder and second-degree murder for both children. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At sentencing, Judge Gregory Caro denounced Ortega's actions, calling them the embodiment of evil and faulting Ortega and her family for failing to seek help for her mental distress. Throughout the trial, the Krim family spoke with heartbreaking clarity. Marina recounted the horror of finding her children's lifeless bodies and called Ortega disgusting for betraying her trust. Kevin Krim in court demanded that Ortega live, rot, and die behind bars, calling her an evil, utterly dangerous narcissist. The public response was one of collective grief and outrage, and the case led to lasting reform. In 2018, New York State passed Lulu and Leo's Law, a measure designed to make it a crime to materially misrepresent the qualifications of childcare workers. Psychologically, experts described Ortega's mindset as deeply disturbed. Her defense argued that she had suffered a psychotic dissociative episode triggered by auditory hallucinations, overwhelming sadness, and financial stress. A forensic psychiatrist testified that she felt overwhelmed by her dual responsibilities, caring for her own son and the Krim children, and entered an altered state of consciousness. The prosecution insisted that the methodical nature of the killings, selecting knives, knowing when the parents were away, and targeting 2 sleeping children, showed criminal intent and awareness of consequences. In closing, let us acknowledge that nothing can excuse or soften the devastation wrought that day. Ortega's act shattered the foundation of a loving family, stole innocent lives, and left scars that cannot heal. Her guilt is absolute and her punishment just. Let this story stand as a solemn warning and a call for vigilance. The safety of children depends on truth, responsibility, and the moral clarity to act when help is needed. 2. Louise Woodward. She was Louise Woodward, a British au pair, working in the Boston area community of Newton, Massachusetts in 1997, and she was 19 years old at the time. She cared for baby Matthew Eapen, 8 months old, in the well-to-do home of the Eapen family, both of whom were medical professionals. Louise arrived from England as part of a cultural exchange program, and in the months before the tragedy, she was seen as a youthful, enthusiastic caregiver, immersed in the family's routine. Her social life was modest. She was in a new country, balancing cultural curiosity with the responsibilities entrusted to her by the Epens. Underneath that composed exterior, there were situational strains. Louise was navigating a foreign environment while managing infant care and household expectations that sometimes felt conflicting. The Epens later testified that they had concerns about her occasional lateness or leaving the children alone while attending to chores. She expressed a sense of exhaustion and frustration, but not violence. Still, the convergence of youth and experience and emotional overwhelm was a fragile mix that would precede tragedy. One winter evening in early February, Louise called emergency services after finding Matthew severely unresponsive. He was rushed to a prominent Boston Children's Hospital and placed on life support. Medical exams revealed the hallmarks of what was then known as shaken baby syndrome, a head injury consistent with bleeding within the skull and eyes, as well as a fractured wrist that showed signs of healing, suggesting an earlier, unnoticed injury. Despite attempts at intervention, Matthew could not recover and passed away several days later. The care she provided was no longer seen as nurturing, but as tragically catastrophic. Police arrested Louise shortly afterward, first for minor charges, then quickly upgrading to first-degree murder as investigators and prosecutors reviewed medical testimony. At her trial in October, pathologists, pediatric radiologists, and ophthalmologists testified that Matthew's neurological trauma pointed to violent shaking and impact. Prosecutors argued Louise had reached a breaking point in frustration, that she had acted out in anger or impatience. Defense experts countered that Matthew's head injury showed signs of healing, making it likely the trauma predated her care. They disputed whether the fatal injury had occurred that same day. The jury returned a verdict of second-degree murder after deliberating for over a day. Judge Hiller-Zobel imposed a mandatory sentence of life in prison with a substantial minimum before parole could be considered. Almost immediately, defense attorneys filed motions questioning whether a verdict that harsh fit the evidence and the defendant's mindset. Weeks later, the judge took the highly unusual step of revisiting the verdict, stating that the circumstances pointed more toward confusion, immaturity, inexperience, and frustration, but not legal malice. In his ruling, he said he was morally certain that upholding a murder conviction would constitute a miscarriage of justice. He reduced the conviction to involuntary manslaughter and ruled that Louise had already served that sentence in the months leading up to and during the trials. She was released from custody the same day. The prosecution appealed to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, but the court upheld the lowered conviction and time-served sentence. Louise returned to the United Kingdom, where she resumed her life away from the intense media glare of the trial. Psychologically, experts characterized Louise's actions as not motivated by cruelty or premeditated harm, but by a crisis of inexperience and overwhelm. No assessment suggested she sought to harm the child. Rather, the tragedy seemed rooted in a moment that spiraled beyond her capacity to manage. The memory of that case endures as a sobering reminder that childcare roles carry profound responsibility. There is no justification for death, no excuse for inadequate training or oversight, yet accountability must be tempered with clarity. Louise's actions cost a child his life. The legal system delivered consequences, but in reducing the charge, it acknowledged complexity without absolution. Let the story stand as a call for rigorous vetting, for support and supervision, and for the moral clarity that even in tragedy, justice must be rooted in fairness, sobriety, and compassion, but never forgiveness of harm inflicted. 3. Olivia Reiner. She was Olivia Reiner, a Swiss au pair, just 20 years old when she arrived in Pound Ridge, New York, in 1991 to care for 6-week-old Christy Fisher in the Fisher family's home. Originally from Veilen, she had previously worked as a pediatrician's assistant and had spent 3 years as a babysitter for another Swiss family before joining the Fisher household through an exchange program. Young, poised, and holding the promise of a new beginning, she carried a reputation of responsibility and warmth, fitting into the family's rhythm with gentle attentiveness. But beneath the calm exterior, the tension of adapting to a new culture and setting loomed. There is little documented evidence of overt behavioral warning signs, yet the pressures of caring for an infant in an unfamiliar environment can strain even the most composed caregiver. There is no record of prior emotional instability or mental health concerns, which only deepened the shock that followed. One night, tragedy struck. A house fire broke out in the Fisher home. Christy Fisher did not survive. The fire led to suspicion of arson, and the circumstances quickly drew attention to Olivia. Authorities and the grieving family believed she suffocated the baby and then set the fire to conceal her actions. The scene became charged with questions of betrayal, forethought, and horrific intent. The investigation focused on whether the fire was intentionally set. The Fisher family claimed Olivia either failed to attempt a rescue or intentionally staged the fire to cover her crime. Prosecutors lodged multiple counts of second-degree murder and arson. The case rapidly became a high-profile spectacle, even paralleling public fears stirred by then-current thriller films about sinister caregivers. At trial, Olivia remained silent for over 13 hours before the jury. After a single day of deliberation, the jury delivered a verdict of not guilty on all counts. Jurors later remarked that the prosecution had failed to provide a clear motive. One juror emphasized that without a credible motive, guilt could not be firmly established. The presiding judge concurred with the verdict. Yet the Fisher family maintained unwavering belief in her guilt, their grief deepened by the verdict's ambiguity. Experts and media commentators weighed in on the outcome. The case was compared to contemporary films like The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, turning it into an international moral flashpoint and intensifying fear among caregiving families. In retrospectives, commentators noted that no one else was ever charged, and the case remained unresolved in public consciousness. Psychological insight into Olivia's motives remains speculative. No formal diagnosis or assessment was made public. Without a motive or any sign of mental illness, the court could not confidently attribute malice. The acquittal rested on reasonable doubt on the absence of clarity about her intent and the lack of forensic proof that she committed either step she was accused of. In closing, we confront the painful tension between grief and justice. A child lost to family shattered, and a caregiver acquitted, not by exoneration of harm, but by the limits of evidence and the integrity of legal standards. This case underscores the devastating consequences when trust is broken, when tragedy yields suspicion, and when clarity remains forever elusive. Justice must be grounded in truth, accountability, and moral clarity. Though the verdict may stand, the memory of Christy Fisher endures always as a reminder of the fragile duty we entrust to those who care for our most vulnerable, and the heartbreak when that trust is betrayed, even in doubt. 4. Christine Falling. She was Christine Laverne Falling, known initially as Christine Slaughter, a teenage babysitter in Florida who began harming children between 1980 and 1982. Born in Perry, her early life was marked by instability. Her father was decades older than her mother, who was herself a minor at Christine's birth, and the family lived below the poverty line. She was considered developmentally delayed, suffered from epilepsy, and spent parts of her childhood in orphanages. From a young age, she showed disturbing behavior, including killing small animals in cruel ways. That early history foreshadowed the tragedy that would follow. In her adolescence, Christine experienced traumatic familial circumstances. At 14, she entered a brief and violent marriage that collapsed after only weeks. Afterwards, she reported frequent unexplained ailments from hallucinations and strange visual disturbances to hypochondriacal symptoms that led to numerous hospital visits, but no clear diagnosis. Her social life was limited. She worked informally as a babysitter, often trusted by neighbors and local families despite her troubled background. Between 1980 and 1982, several children under her care died under suspicious circumstances. In one case, she babysat a toddler, Cassidy Johnson. Christine later said the child passed out and fell from her crib, but an autopsy showed blunt force trauma to the skull, and suspicions were raised, though not pursued at the time. Soon after, 2 cousins died on separate occasions under her watch, first from heart inflammation and then from what was reported as a viral infection. In each case, the deaths were deemed natural causes. The pattern continued when she cared for her infant niece, who also died unexpectedly, again ruled as sudden infant death syndrome. The turning point came one hot summer in 1982 when Christine was caring for 10-week-old Travis Coleman. He died, and a subsequent examination revealed suffocation injuries that raised red flags. Authorities pressed Christine, and in custody, she confessed to killing 3 children, Cassidy Johnson, Jennifer Daniels, her niece, and Travis Coleman, by smothering them with pillows or blankets. She said she heard voices telling her, "Kill the baby." Her confession led Christine to plead guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder in December 1982. In exchange, authorities did not charge her for the 2 cousin deaths or the elderly man who died under her care, and the state waived the death penalty. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. Public reaction was one of horror and betrayal. Communities that entrusted her with their children were shaken to their core. Investigators and prosecutors emphasized the extraordinary breach of trust and the inexplicable nature of her actions. Psychologically, Christine's motives remained deeply disturbing. She described hallucinations and external voices, but no formal mental health diagnosis was publicly disclosed to explain her actions in detail. Her behavior suggested a psychotic break or dissociative state, but her confession and the methodical nature of the smotherings suggested awareness and intent. In closing, we confront a terrifying betrayal of innocence that cost multiple young lives. Trust invited her into homes, and that trust was irreparably destroyed. Her sentence is just and her guilt clear. This case serves as a stark warning. The safety of children must be safeguarded by vigilance, accountability, and uncompromising standards. There is no justification, no softness of penalty, and no forgetting the harm inflicted. Let this story leave us with a renewed commitment to protect the vulnerable and demand moral clarity always. 5. Diane Odell. She was Diane Odell, born in 1953 in Orwell Township, Pennsylvania. In the early 1980s, she operated a home daycare in Sullivan County, New York, caring for infants amidst a life that outwardly seemed ordinary and maternal. She had already raised 8 children, beautiful and healthy, all born in hospitals, nurtured in loving homes. Neighbors viewed her as a doting mother and a private woman, perhaps headstrong and difficult at work, but caring when it came to her brood. But behind that caring facade, tragedies began accumulating. Between 1982 and 1985, she gave birth to 3 additional infants in secret, born in her home's bathroom, with no prenatal care in circumstances she carefully hid. These infants born outside relationships remained undisclosed to her family and her community. Then, in 2003, a chilling discovery broke open the hidden truth. A landlord in Safford, Arizona, rented out her long-abandoned storage unit used in the early 1990s and paid sporadically until the check stopped, only to uncover 3 small cardboard boxes. Inside were the bodies of the infants, mummified with time, kept secret for decades. The case that emerged became known as the Babies in Boxes murder case. Authorities across state lines converged. Diane was tracked through her Pennsylvania residence and brought to New York. She was soon indicted on multiple charges of second-degree murder for causing the deaths of her infants through intentional acts or by depraved indifference. At trial, prosecutors asserted that she hid not merely the births, but the deaths, keeping their remains as if they were possessions rather than tragedies. Facing a jury, Diane's defense painted a portrait of a mother overwhelmed, ashamed, haunted by her past, and lacking support. She claimed the babies had simply died shortly after birth and that she had kept them in storage while hoping someday for a proper farewell. But jurors found otherwise. They convicted her unanimously of all counts of second-degree murder for depraved indifference and intentional causing of death, rejecting any claims of natural loss. Her sentence was severe and unyielding, multiple concurrent terms of life imprisonment with minimum terms extending decades into the future. Her conviction sent shockwaves through communities and across media outlets, dismantling any comforting assumptions about maternal instinct, revealing instead a shocking betrayal of the most vulnerable. Psychologically, the case remains deeply unsettling. No formal diagnosis was released, but experts and commentators speculated about trauma, shame, and a pattern of concealment rooted in fear and denial. Her decision to carry infants, then lock their remains away for years, speaks of a fractured mind that failed to reconcile motherhood's social expectations and hidden despair. In closing, the story of Diane Odell is a harrowing account of maternal betrayal, hidden tragedy, and moral rupture. The punishment she received is justified and necessary. No psychological complexity can lessen the responsibility for innocent lives hidden and ultimately lost. Let this case stand as an urgent reminder the safety of children demands transparency, compassion, and the unwavering courage to confront difficult truths even when they lie within the sanctuaries of home. 6. Lorie Connley. She was Lorie Ann Connley, 43 years old at the time of her arrest in Reynoldsburg, Ohio. In 2016, she worked as an unlicensed babysitter from her home, caring for multiple toddlers and infants while raising her own 3 teenage children. Neighbors described her as quiet, private someone who kept to herself, respectful, but distant, with a modest social presence that did not raise alarm. Behind closed doors, however, situational strains began to emerge. She juggled financial pressures, the demands of caring for several young children alone, and the responsibilities of motherhood without professional support. There was no public record of mental illness, but the burden of exhaustion and inexperience loomed over her daily routine, a fragile mix with frightening potential consequences. One May afternoon, tragedy struck. Haddix Mulkey, an 8-month-old baby in her care, became unresponsive. Connley called emergency services, and first responders rushed the child to a children's hospital in Columbus, where Haddix was pronounced dead. In the days that followed, toxicology results revealed that Haddix had ingested an adult dose of Benadryl, an over-the-counter antihistamine unsuitable for infants and potentially lethal. It was later confirmed that Connley had administered that dose in an attempt to calm a fussy baby. Investigators discovered she had 8 children under 6 years old in her home that day. She was indicted by a grand jury on charges of involuntary manslaughter, child endangerment, and tampering with evidence. The prosecutor emphasized that giving Benadryl to a baby can and did cause the death of this infant, warning clearly against administering medication without a physician's approval. At her sentencing hearing in 2017, Connley pleaded guilty to all counts. The court sentenced her to 15 years in prison. The sentence reflected the gravity of a single act that shattered a family and undermined the trust placed in her role as a caregiver. Public reaction was one of shock and heartbreak. The infant's mother, Katie Mulkey, described her son as a joyful child just learning to crawl and excited by vanilla ice cream, and expressed profound grief at the senselessness of his loss. Many parents resonated with her warning over-the-counter medications can be unknowingly dangerous when used without care. Psychologically, the motivation behind Connley's action remains deeply troubling. She told investigators she did not intend harm, that she simply wanted a restless baby to sleep. But that explanation revealed a dangerous disregard for vulnerability and medical guidelines. No formal psychological evaluation was publicly cited, and no evidence suggested malice, yet the act exposed a catastrophic lapse in judgment and responsibility. In closing, this tragedy stands as a stark condemnation of negligent caregiving. The choice to administer inappropriate medication to a defenseless child can never be excused or softened. The punishment she received, 15 years in prison, reflects society's moral clarity that the safety of children cannot be compromised by exhaustion, ignorance, or misplaced convenience. Let this story serve as a solemn reminder: caregiving demands vigilance, knowledge, and unwavering commitment. Nothing can undo the harm done, but may justice reaffirm our duty to protect the most vulnerable with uncompromising care and responsibility. 7. Melissa Haskell. She was meant to be the picture of trust, the young neighbor or family friend who promised to keep a watchful eye while parents worked or rested. In many homes, the babysitter is seen as an extension of family, someone who carries the sacred duty of protecting a child. But in the town of Bridgeport, Pennsylvania, that image was shattered when the girl hired to care for an infant harbored a darkness no one imagined. The child was 5-month-old Ryan Borley, a baby just beginning to smile, babble, and light up his parents' world. His family entrusted him to 18-year-old Melissa Haskell, who seemed responsible enough despite her own personal struggles. For weeks, she watched over Ryan in his Upper Marion Township home, a place where safety and warmth should have surrounded him. On an August morning in 1992, everything changed. Melissa was alone with Ryan when the baby began to cry. What happened next would haunt his family for decades. She later admitted in a taped conversation that in her frustration and weakened state from drug withdrawal, she put her hand over the baby's mouth and nose. Hours later, Ryan was found unresponsive. At first, authorities labeled the tragedy as sudden infant death syndrome, leaving his family devastated but without answers. The truth did not surface until nearly 2 decades later. Melissa had long battled addiction and was involved in a bitter custody dispute with her ex-husband. In a recorded conversation, she confessed that she had silenced Ryan in desperation. That confession prompted investigators to reopen the case in 2011. Medical files were re-examined, and the coroner changed the cause of death to suffocation with acute alcohol intoxication listed as a contributing factor. The alcohol in the infant's blood suggested he may have been given liquor in an attempt to quiet him. The investigation led to a courtroom drama filled with painful testimony. The prosecution argued that Melissa's admission paired with the medical evidence proved she had acted with malice. They painted her as a troubled young woman, overwhelmed by her own addiction, incapable of controlling her rage when the baby cried. The defense countered that her words were coerced during a vulnerable moment and that the science behind the alcohol findings was unreliable. Expert witnesses debated whether fermentation after death could explain the toxicology results, but the jury was not convinced. In June of 2012, after days of testimony, Melissa Haskell was found guilty of third-degree murder. She faced the maximum penalty allowed under the law at the time of the crime. That October, she stood before the court choking back tears, insisting she had loved the child. The judge, unmoved, told her the jury had spoken and sentenced her to a prison term of 10 to 20 years. For Ryan's family, the verdict could not erase the pain of losing their first son. 2 decades of uncertainty had been replaced by the harsh truth that their trust had been betrayed by the very person they had allowed into their home. For the community, the case was a chilling reminder that even those placed in roles of trust can harbor dangerous secrets. In the years since Melissa has remained in prison, her story a cautionary tale of how addiction, frustration, and poor choices can converge into tragedy. The legacy of this crime lives on not only in the sorrow of the Borley family, but in the cautionary awareness it instilled in countless others. It underscores a devastating truth. When trust is betrayed, the consequences can echo across generations. In the end, the lesson is painfully clear. A babysitter's role is to protect, nurture, and guard life's most precious gift. When that duty is broken, it leaves scars no sentence can ever truly heal. Society must never forget the fragile trust placed in caregivers and the responsibility that comes with it. 8. Elżbieta Plackowska. She presented as the responsible neighbor the babysitter many families trusted. In suburban Naperville, Illinois, she seemed ordinary, someone who stepped in when parents needed an extra hand. She held a recognizable role, trusted, familiar, quietly dependable. Yet beneath that cultivated calm lay a hidden anguish, a storm that no one anticipated. The children at the heart of this tragedy were her own 7-year-old son, Justin, and 5-year-old Olivia Dworkowski, a neighbor's child whom she often cared for. Both were young, bright, and innocent, too young to understand the betrayal awaiting them. They were tucked into the sanctity of their homes and bedtime routines, trusting the woman they knew to care for them would keep them safe. On an autumn night in 2012, what should have been quiet bedtime moments unraveled into terror. According to prosecutors, the children were told to prepare for sleep, but instead began jumping on the bed. In that moment, a horrific choice was made. The babysitter, whose duty was protection, grabbed a kitchen knife. In the master bedroom, forced to kneel and pray, Justin and Olivia were stabbed in a sequence of violence that defied comprehension. Later, 2 family dogs were also found dead. She then fled, covered in blood, to a friend's home where police confronted her. The motives behind such actions are chilling. Prosecutors presented her own words to investigators. "I'm not supposed to, but I have to." They argued that an emotional rupture, anger toward her husband, a long-haul trucker off and away, drove her to claim agency through violence. She admitted acting to lash out at him hurt him the way she felt hurt. Olivia, she said, witnessed Justin's death and had to be eliminated too. The defense tried an insanity plea pointing to possible psychotic breakdown, but the judge was unconvinced. He found that despite any mental distress, she understood that what she did was wrong. Her shifting stories, first blaming a robber, then hearing devilish voices, then trying to purge evil, only reinforced her awareness of wrongness. By late September of 2017, after a bench trial lasting nearly 3 weeks, she was convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder and aggravated cruelty. In December, the court imposed a natural life sentence without the possibility of parole, ensuring she remains behind bars for the remainder of her life. In the aftermath, the Naperville community reeled from a grief beyond words. Wakes and funerals underscored the loss of 2 young lives gone before their time. Schools, neighbors, even first responders required counseling to cope with the trauma of entering that scene. Families struggled to rebuild trust, and mothers and fathers held their children tighter. In the cold silence of prison, she lives on, confined by walls and memories of what she took from the world. The community carries the weight of what happened, 2 small futures extinguished. The legacy of this night remains a warning. This case forces us to confront the darkest depths of human betrayal. A babysitter, someone entrusted with the most vulnerable, became a predator. Society must never lose sight of the fragility of trust. A caregiver's role is pure, but when it fractures, the consequences can shatter lives. Let this tragedy remind us. Vigilance, mental health support, and community awareness are vital defenses. In the end, the betrayal here was absolute, and its echo will endure long after the courtroom lights dim. 9. Marissa Tietsort. Marissa Tietsort, 31 years old at the time of her sentencing, was a babysitter from Wausau, Wisconsin. She was known locally as a struggling mother, already caring for several of her own children and pregnant with another. Neighbors described her as someone trying to manage chaos, juggling children, personal hardship, and little support. She had a history of childcare that raised concern, but before the tragic event, she was still seen as a familiar figure, someone entrusted to look after families' most precious treasures. In the months leading up to the incident, signs of instability were present. One mother reported her infant had facial injuries inconsistent with a fall, raising questions about Tietsort's behavior. Another child, only 3 months old, reportedly arrived with a skull fracture after being under her care. Those incidents hinted at emotional turbulence and possible unresolved trauma, but no legal action had yet been taken. It's a chilling reminder that warning signs can go unnoticed, especially when overwhelmed individuals are caring for vulnerable children. On a quiet October afternoon in 2018, a mother dropped off her 11-week-old son and his older brother with Tietsort. A few hours later, the unsuspecting mother believed her infant was merely asleep when he was returned in a snowsuit car seat, neatly strapped in, and a hat pulled down over his eyes. She soon discovered that her baby was unresponsive, cold, and rigid. Emergency responders arriving at a laundromat found her performing desperate chest compressions, but the child had already passed. When questioned, Tietsort admitted the infant had died in her care, yet she made no effort to call for help or perform resuscitation. Instead, she dressed him and returned him to his mother, pretending he was asleep. Later, she went to a fast food restaurant and then swam at a hotel with her boyfriend in children actions that left the public shaken and horrified. During the investigation, authorities discovered that this was not an isolated incident. In August of that same year, Tietsort faced a child abuse charge involving an 11-month-old girl, and in 2017, another infant in her care had suffered a skull fracture. These cases painted a pattern of dangerous behavior, one that was finally forced into legal scrutiny. In court, Marissa Tietsort entered a plea of no contest to first-degree reckless homicide and to child abuse causing intentional harm. Through the plea agreement, the original charge of intentional homicide was reduced, but the gravity remained. On sentencing, the judge imposed a prison term of 43 years, followed by an additional 23 years of extended supervision, ensuring she would remain under strict oversight for decades to come. Psychological experts offered interpretations of her actions as rooted in overwhelming emotional strain denial and possibly deep-seated anger, yet none excused the crime. The court concluded that while she may have been struggling mentally or emotionally, she was fully capable of understanding the magnitude of her actions, making the betrayal all the more damning. This case serves as a stark warning to every community. When caregivers, those we entrust with our most vulnerable, turn harmful, the consequences are devastating and irreversible. The crimes were not accidents, and they are not softened by speculation. Accountability remains paramount. Let this be a resolute moment of moral clarity. The duty to protect children is absolute. When that duty is broken, justice must be unwavering. Marissa Tietsort's actions destroyed a small life and shattered trust in profound ways. And though she may be confined behind bars, the echoes of her betrayal will linger, reminding us all of the weight of responsibility carried by those who care for children. 10. Michelle Heale. Michelle Heale was 44 years old at the time of the incident and worked as a babysitter in Toms River, New Jersey. She lived in a tight-knit suburban community and was entrusted by families to care for their children, including 14-month-old Mason Hess, whom she had watched regularly. Before tragedy struck, she seemed to project a calm, helpful image, someone whom parents could count on when they needed support. In the weeks before Mason's collapse, Michelle's life appeared strained but not alarming. On the day before the incident, Mason had thrown up and was diagnosed with an ear and upper respiratory infection. His mother, Kelly, offered to keep him home, but Michelle reassured her that everyone would be fine texts, revealing concern but no hint of crisis. On that afternoon in late August 2012, Mason was dropped off healthy. According to Michelle, around 2 o'clock, she fed him applesauce. He began to cough. She patted him on the back, and suddenly he went limp in her arms. Frantic, she ran to the phone to call emergency services. His whole body is lifeless, she told the 911 operator. Within days at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, doctors diagnosed Mason with severe brain injury and bleeding in the eyes, assigning his collapse to abusive head trauma, a medical determination upheld by prosecutors. During her trial, Michelle demonstrated on a doll how she hit Mason between the shoulder blades to clear his airway when he choked on applesauce, insisting it was an act of rescue, not harm, and that she never intended to hurt him. Medical testimony was split. The state presented experts declaring the infant's injuries unmistakably consistent with violent shaking, while the defense offered testimony from professionals challenging that interpretation, arguing that illness or accidental factors could explain the findings. In April 2015, a Monmouth County jury found Michelle guilty of aggravated manslaughter and child endangerment, though they spared her a murder conviction. She faced a potential maximum of 30 years behind bars. In late June, the judge delivered the sentence 15 years in prison. In the public eye, the verdict cast Michelle as a caretaker gone tragically wrong. Mason's family viewed the crime as unforgivable. At sentencing, Mason's mother labeled Michelle a monster, and his father said only an evil being would hurt a child. Over time, however, questions began to emerge around the science behind shaken baby syndrome. Reports and legal advocates highlighted how the diagnosis rests on contested medical frameworks. In 2020, experts and legal scholars weighed in, calling the evidence against Michelle potentially flawed and advocating for a review of her case by New Jersey's Conviction Review Unit. Her case underscores the tension between trust and tragedy. A babysitter who was meant to protect ended up accused of causing unfathomable harm. Regardless of those debates, a child's life was lost, and justice followed according to the law as it stood. The broader debate over scientific interpretation does not soften the burden of that outcome. This story stands as a solemn reminder caregivers hold a sacred duty to preserve life. When the worst occurs in that role, there can be no excuse, only accountability. The loss of Mason Hess remains a profound wound. Justice in this case demanded that the person entrusted with his care answer unflinchingly for what happened under her watch. 11. Dixie Denise Villa. Dixie Denise Villa was 40 years old when she was found guilty of manslaughter in the overdose death of 7-month-old Abigail Lobish, a child she babysat at her home on the Aliamanu military reservation on Oahu, Hawaii. She operated an unlicensed daycare from her home and was seen as a caregiver managing multiple young children. Her public image before the tragedy was that of a hard-working caretaker drawing in trust from families within the community. Circumstances that led to the crime appear rooted in being overwhelmed by caregiving responsibilities. Prosecutors highlighted that Villa was caring for Abigail as well as a toddler and 2 of her own children, all under the age of 5, when the incident occurred. These pressures may have influenced her decision to administer diphenhydramine to quiet Abigail, a choice rooted in desperation rather than deliberate harm. On a peaceful night in February 2019, the parents left their infant daughter under Villa's care. Hours later, Abigail was discovered unresponsive. An autopsy revealed diphenhydramine toxicity, an adult medication ingredient not meant for infants. The evidence indicated a fatal dose had been administered without a doctor's authorization or parental knowledge. The investigation unveiled that Villa was the only person present with the child during that time. Prosecutors maintained she gave the drug to quiet Abigail while juggling the needs of multiple children, including using tablets to pacify the others. The defense argued reasonable doubt suggesting Abigail's mother or others could have administered the drug or that breastfeeding transfer was possible. In November 2024, after 3 days of testimony and over 7 hours of jury deliberations, the jury found Villa guilty of manslaughter. Her bail was increased, and she was taken into custody following the verdict. In April 2025, she requested a new trial claiming withheld evidence and disputing the credibility of the toddler's mother. The judge denied the motion, noting the additional evidence would not have swayed the jury's decision. On May 7th, 2025, the judge sentenced Villa to the maximum sentence under Hawaii law, 20 years in prison for manslaughter. The prosecution argued that no such drug should ever be given to a child under 6 without explicit medical authorization. The judge affirmed this stance, calling the facts and the law clear, and stating that the sentence was the only appropriate outcome. The infant's mother spoke in court, tearfully expressing that my heart has never stopped hurting, and that the weight of now living without her daughter would remain a heavy weight every day until they might be reunited. Psychological interpretations of Villa's actions suggest a fraught mix of exhaustion, stress, and desperation, but none of that excuses the outcome. No expert testimony undermined the reality that she understood the risks and chose to administer a dangerous medication to an infant without oversight. Accountability stands firm in this case. This tragic episode serves as a chilling reminder that caregiving is not an occasional responsibility, it is a sacred trust. When that trust is violated, the consequences are irreversible. Abigail's life was cut short by a decision made in a moment of overwhelmed judgment. Justice demanded accountability, and though imprisonment may offer closure, it cannot restore the child lost. Let this stand as a moral imperative. Caregivers must be held to the highest standards with no exceptions. 12. Stacy Lynn Vaillancourt. Stacy Lynn Vaillancourt was 59 years old at the time of her conviction and worked as a home daycare provider in Rutland, Vermont. For decades, she operated a nurturing environment, welcoming families into her residence with an air of quiet reliability. The parents trusted her deeply, believing she offered not only care but a second home for their infants. But beneath that trusted facade lay a moment of devastating judgment. Among the children in her care was 6-month-old Harper Rose Breyer, a baby described by witnesses as fussy and having difficulty sleeping. On Harper's third day under Vaillancourt's care in January 2019, something went catastrophically wrong. The pressures of caring for multiple children likely weighed on her, but no formal signs of instability were documented, only the heartbreaking outcome. On that day, Harper was discovered unresponsive in her crib. Emergency responders arrived, but she tragically passed away at the hospital. The autopsy revealed the cause, diphenhydramine intoxication, the sedative ingredient in common antihistamines, such as Benadryl, without any prescription for an infant. The conclusion was unequivocal. She suffered a fatal overdose. The investigation hinged on who could have administered that drug, as no one other than Vaillancourt was present. Prosecutors argued convincingly that only she could have given it, breaking a sacred trust placed by families. At trial, she denied giving Harper anything beyond parental provisions, but jury deliberations left no doubt. In December 2023, she was convicted of involuntary manslaughter and child cruelty resulting in death. In March 2024, she was sentenced to 3 to 10 years in prison pursuant to state law for her 2 felony convictions. The sentence, though legally appropriate, felt like cold justice for a loss no one can truly mend. Vaillancourt appealed, arguing that evidence was insufficient, and the 2 convictions violated double jeopardy protections. She also challenged the admission of videos of the infant, claiming they were prejudicial. But in May 2025, the Vermont Supreme Court unanimously upheld her convictions, affirming that the jury had sufficient evidence and no constitutional errors were made. Beyond the criminal courtroom, the emotional consequences lingered. The state agreed to pay nearly $200,000 in a wrongful death settlement to Harper's parents, reflecting systemic failures in protecting vulnerable children. Psychological interpretations suggest that Vaillancourt's action was born of extraordinary stress or desire to soothe, but none of that excuses the fatal result. She was an experienced caregiver, aware of the risks of administering medications without consent. The court's ruling underscored that negligence in a caregiving role, when it ends in tragedy, demands accountability. The death of Harper Rose Breyer stands as a painful illustration of how easily trust can be broken. Parents entrust their most sacred bond to a caregiver, hoping for safety and compassion. But in this case, that bond was brutally violated. The sentence and the failed appeal reflect a society's insistence on moral clarity and justice, even when justice can never repair a shattered life. Let the story leave viewers with a firm, unshakable truth. Caregivers carry a solemn duty, a responsibility that, when abused, shatters families and communities. No defense can soften the loss. Accountability remains the only guard against unconscionable betrayal.